Watch closely. For 40 moves, this looks like a sleepy draw, and then black's own king strolls up the board to hunt white down. Montiel opens, pawn to d4 at the 2026 American Continental. Calm, classical, nothing to fear. Noboa replies, knight to f6, settling in, giving away nothing. Outslides the bishop to f4, white stacking a quiet, solid little structure. Pawn to e6 answers, and black bolts the center shut. A second pawn nudges to e3, propping up the wall. Black's bishop tucks onto e7, unhurried, almost sleepy. Now, a tiny pawn step to h3, heir for the king, nothing more. Quietly, Noboa plays for the long diagonal, pawn to b6. The last knight comes to f3, white fully developed and comfortable. In comes the second bishop to b7, eyes locked on a distant horizon. Modestly, the bishop drops to e2, no ambition, just safety. Here's the first probe. Black strikes with the pawn to c5. Carefully, white answers c3, holding the middle together. Patiently, the d6 pawn appears, black's chain taking shape. Both kings will hide now. White castles, tucked safely away. Mirror image, black castles, and the board sits in perfect, eerie balance. Developing the last piece, white's knight slides to d2. Tension snaps, black's pawn takes on d4, opening lines at last. White recaptures on d4, and the center cracks open. Off to c7 goes the queen, lining up against white's king. Up to e1 comes a rook, grabbing the open file. Across the board, the answer comes, rook to e8. Back tucks the bishop to h2, keeping the long diagonal alive. Slowly, the queenside knight develops to d7. Regrouping, white's bishop drops back to f1, hunting a new diagonal. Rerouting begins. The knight steps back to f8. Suddenly, the bishop lunges to b5, poking at black's setup. Sidestepping, black's rook shifts to d8, dodging the pin. White's queen lifts to e2, joining the slow build-up. And the knight completes its journey, landing on g6. Doubling up, white brings the second rook to d1. Probing softly, black plays a 6 and pesters the bishop. Retreating, the bishop holds a 4, refusing to leave the diagonal. Expanding, the b-pawn rolls to b5, claiming space. Swinging on to c2, the bishop aims straight at black's king. Centralizing, black's other knight leaps to d5, planting itself proudly. Surprisingly, Montiel's bishop grabs the knight on g6, wrecking black's pawn shield. Recapturing, the h-pawn takes back, and the h-file yawns open for black. Into the center jumps the knight to e4, eyeing weak squares. Onto c6 steps the queen, feeding the long diagonal. Shifting gears, a rook returns to c1 to fight for the file. Lane for lane, black answers with a rook to c8. Searching for a plan, a rook drifts back to d1, unsure of itself. Sensing it, black's rook slides to e8, probing for the soft spot. Backward shuffles the knight to e1, strangely timid. Flag planted, the f-pawn storms to f5, black taking the kingside. Yielding the center, the knight slips to d2. Awake at last, black's other bishop swings to g5, biting in. First misstep, the rook wanders to a 1, aimless. On c2, it stays active and defends. Here just burns time, and black smells blood. Striking the center, the e-pawn jumps t5. Snatched, the d-pawn takes on e5, tearing the center wide. Right back, the d-pawn recaptures on e5, the center now raw and open. Sidling out, Montiel's knight goes to b3, reaching for play. Pressing harder, the queen drops to b6, hunting targets. That sleepy knight finally wakes, hopping to d3. Overreaching, black sends the knight to f4. Scary looking, but the pawn to e4 was stronger, clamping white down. Now the knight just gets swapped. Instantly, white takes the knight on f4, accepting the swap. Jammed on f4 now sits a black pawn, a thorn white can't ignore. Another slip, the queen lands on d2, clumsy. On d3, she'd stay active and guard the king. Here she just drifts, and black swarms. There it is, the long-range bishop dives in, snatching the pawn on g2 beside white's king. Hitting back, White's bishop scoops up the thorn on f4. Coolly, the bishop slides home to a8, settling onto the longest diagonal. Trading bishops on g5 looks tidy, but the knight to d4 was stronger, a monster in the center. The swap helps only black. Lining up, the queen returns to c6. Queen and bishop now aim down one deadly diagonal at White's king. Just in time, White's queen crashes on a d5 with check, jamming the door shut on that diagonal. Queens collide. Black snaps the white queen on d5. Forced, the rook recaptures the queen on d5. All the way down comes the bishop to d5, devouring the rook, and black emerges holding the sharper pieces. Clinging on, Montiel drops the knight onto d4. Pushing on, the b-pawn rolls to b4, opening a second front. Backpedaling, the bishop returns to d2, all defense. Lifting the rook to e4, black charges deep into White's half. Jabbing back, the f-pawn pokes to f3 to shove the rook away. Sliding sideways, the rook swings to h4, hunting near White's king. Nervously, the king steps to g2, hoping for shelter. Cracking the queen's side, the b-pawn takes on c3. Retaking on c3, White's whole structure groans and cracks. Something bizarre starts here. Black's king strolls out to f7, marching toward the battle instead of hiding. Edgy now, White's king steps to g3, more and more exposed. Piling onto the h-file, Black's other rook lands on h8. Scrambling, a rook rushes to h1 to fight for the open file. Onward, the king marches to f6, deeper into White's territory. Passive and lost, the bishop crawls to e1. A pawn to c4 would have made counterplay. Instead, White waits, helpless, to be squeezed. Rolling forward, the g-pawn advances to g5, gaining yet more space. Bracing, the rook sinks to h2 as the storm gathers. Calmly, the king strolls to g6, untouched in the middle of it all. Yet another miss. The knight to e2 helps nobody. The rook back to h1 was the call, holding the file. Now Black seizes control. Repositioning, Black's rook glides to e8, finding a cleaner path in. Aimlessly, the bishop returns to d2, out of useful ideas. Switching wings, the rook flies to a 4 in an instant. Cowering, the knight tucks on a c1, utterly passive. Greedy and good. Noboa's bishop grabs the pawn on a 2, pocketing material. Desperation, the bishop grabs the pawn on g5, but it's a gift. The rook to g2 still held. This only feeds Black's attack. Look where the king goes. It captures the bishop on g5, prowling deep in White's camp. Check. The h-pawn lunges to h4, jabbing at that wandering king. Unbothered, the king sidesteps to h5, still marching. Clawing back, the knight grabs the bishop on a 2 from the rim. Tighter and tighter. The f-pawn slides to f4 with check, squeezing White's king. Running low on squares, the king edges to h3. Down drops the rook to e3, tying White to the back rank. Plugging gaps, the rook slides to f2. Even Noboa stumbles. The rook snatches the knight on a 2. Yet the rook to a 3 kept the squeeze tighter. White gets a breath. Gratefully, White takes the rook on a 2. Relentless, the rook rips the pawn off f3 with check, never letting up. Cornered, the king slinks to h2. Still, the king feasts. It captures the pawn on h4, creeping closer to White's. Fatal greed. The rook grabs the pawn on a 6. It had to defend on c2. Now the king stands alone, the end near. Fresh fuel. Another pawn rolls up to g5, sealing the cage. One last gasp. The c-pawn lurches to c4. Driving once more, the rook returns to f2 with check. Nowhere left, the king staggers to g1. Setting the trap, the rook slips to c2 for the finish. Flailing now, the rook lunges to c6. The rook to b6 held out longer, yet nothing truly saves White here. Face to face now, the black king steps on a g3, right next to its enemy. Trembling, White's king flees to f1. No shelter anywhere. Then, almost gently, the pawn creeps to f3, and it's over. King on g3, rook lurking, no defense left. Montiel resigns. Black wins.